All right, Tuesday night, Dan and Omar show, and it's the European Super League, which you could have, I suppose, a discussion on it at any point in at any point in the last 10 years. I remember reading, actually, I tweeted about this probably about a year ago, where I used to collect the Match magazine annuals. And so they had a section one of the annuals, probably like the year 2000. They had something on a European Super League and what would it look like. I might share that after this on Twitter. But they basically went, okay, this is what this is what's being moved to. This is what it could look like. So it's kind of a talking point that's been around for years and years and years, but it's reared its head again for some people, or is a kind of exciting new development for others this week. What's going on, Dan? What's the latest? What's the latest proposals that are coming out?
Well, yeah, I mean, we talked about it briefly, I think, a little bit ago when we were talking about Project Big Picture as well, weren't we? About everything in the mix, and whether all of these discussions have been accelerated because of COVID, because of the big losses. We saw the Deloitte report out today talking about, well, at one point, like, and I know that Barcelona's financial figures look horrendous, where they've got sort of debt of over €1 billion, if I remember correctly. And all of that as the backdrop, I presume, has led obviously to quite big losses even at the larger clubs, and has led then obviously to those larger clubs being thinking about how can, I guess cynically, individually, but also in some type of collective manner, how are they going to be able to plug that hole, fill the gap, and try and either recoup those losses or look to be able to find more lucrative avenues going forward. And so I think almost in a way, what came as a surprise, I think it was last week, I'm going to have a quick look at the statement as well, that UEFA, it was on the FIFA website, that FIFA, UEFA, all the various confederations also came up with a sort of joint statement, in a way, I guess, validating that the concern that it's only been reported in the press really to date. This was almost the first open public statement, shot across the bows to a degree, but I presume that is because those bodies and entities are pretty worried about what is presumably going on behind the scenes, which is discussions about the possibility of a Super League. Now, depending on how we class European Super League or Super League anyway, some people argue we've already got a Super League to a degree. The European Cup, as it was pre-92, I think it was, is a very, very different beast to the multi-layered, what sometimes was number of leagues and then knockouts and then stages, which effectively guaranteed more games and the best teams playing against each other, and the less likelihood of being knocked out against in the first round, i.e. elongating those revenue streams out. But, what UEFA and FIFA and the confederations more or less put in place as a sort of warning shot was, you clubs, if you're thinking about this, just as I guess the clubs are leveraging their position to ultimately perhaps get more money from UEFA and maybe FIFA in the club World Cup elements of things that they're planning, was if you go away and break away, be very careful what you wish for, because your players might not be able to play in UEFA and FIFA sanctioned national tournaments. And again, we only have to look back to 1992 and the Premier League breaking away from the Football League. It's not that long ago since everybody just accepts the Premier League as the status quo now. But, the best part of, 30 years ago, that certainly wasn't the case. So I think
it's a preemptive strike in a way, isn't it? Because they, I suspect if the Super League did break away and you had these players playing in a Super League and they weren't allowed to play in a World Cup or a Champions League and so on, the World Cup and Champions League are not going to be attractive propositions because they're just not going to have the best players. So actually, it's FIFA and UEFA coming forward and really going, we're calling chicken, I guess, in a way, because they could certainly not live with those players not being in their competitions.
And also, if I can just mention one point as well, which is the other dynamic, which I know we've talked about previously, is what are the clubs actually talking about when they talk about a breakaway Super League, are they talking about a breakaway European Super League breaking away from the UEFA Champions League and Europa League, wherever else it might be? Because it seems like that is what's on the table more than a substantive breakaway from all domestic competition. So in a way, and there's obviously a few nuances in that, but it doesn't seem that it's like, okay, Liverpool and others, and then Juventus and others, and Barcelona and others, and Munich and others, wherever else it might be, are not going to play domestic competition anymore. It is what are the opportunities during the windows that are currently, I guess, reserved for UCL matches to be able to then to be able to come up with something more lucrative. And then, as we talked about last time, that groundswell towards, are there more game week opportunities to be able to then sell more of the bigger premium games midweek because of the way that the fixtures are scheduled throughout the international calendar?
Yeah, so you're absolutely right that this latest positioning does seem to be, a replacement for the Champions League. And we've seen, as you said, an angling for greater revenues, greater access spots. So, a really simple illustration of the, I guess, strength of the big leagues and the big clubs in the big leagues is that the Premier League now has 4 guaranteed group stage slots in the Champions League. That it used to be 1 qualifier, which placed a little bit of jeopardy, and English teams did lose that game, and it used to be obviously 3 and then and 2 before that. So they've kind of increased their position, and that's through, in part, having that threat of a breakaway league. But I think the key aspect of having potential European Super League and domestic leagues is that this element of relegation and needing to qualify for the Super League, and certainly the reports that emerged over the last last couple of days or so suggest that there would be these teams that essentially had permanent positions within the Super League, so they don't have to worry about losing games and getting relegated and having to re-qualify for the Super League. If there was a re-qualification process, it'd be through the league, but if they don't have to worry about the league, then the league is in many ways glorified friendlies.
Yeah.
It's Man United come to Burnley this week, and Burnley get to see kind of the Harlem Globetrotters or whatever. So that's, I think, how a cynical perspective on it would be that if you lock your position in that league, then essentially the league just becomes almost like a bit of additional narrative during the season to add a bit of kind of diversity from potentially these big teams actually losing games on a much more regular basis than they do today.
Can I ask one bit there, which I find interesting, just sparked off a thought that I had based on a podcast I was listening to, which was, I know we take Liverpool as example, maybe sort of conscious or subconscious bias, unconscious bias, or otherwise, or example led. But I thought, when you break things down into maybe more monetary value and opportunity cost, and you're looking at Liverpool over the last 5, 6 years under Klopp, where they haven't prioritised the FA Cup, for example. I presume it's not because of that no one doesn't want the glory of the FA Cup, but the opportunity cost of going out early versus the opportunity cost of the value that attracts to winning the FA Cup, which is very small. It's almost 1.5 places of in the Premier League, effectively. Whether that then leads on to the same type of narrative and explanation of, if there is a semi-closed Champions League and the riches are very much in there, query, we can talk about competitive balance in a second, but the actual issue then becomes is that the priority for all of those teams that are permanent members becomes the Super League, as you said, not the domestic league. Even if the domestic league is still quite valuable, it's very valuable to everyone else in the league who isn't in the Super League. But for those that are in the Super League, ultimately their position's entrenched, and that becomes less of an issue.
Yeah, exactly. It's just, you're right. It becomes, you wonder what would happen to the FA Cup in that scenario, because it becomes an even lesser competition, right? So, yeah, you're absolutely right. I think that's kind of natural extension of what's being discussed here. I think going back to the kind of FIFA UEFA statement that came out, we were discussing pre-show, and you said it was interesting to you. I think it's interesting to anyone, the idea of this kind of antitrust competition law around, can a governing body say you're not allowed to play in our competitions on essentially a non-sporting issue, if you like. So what are the grounds that FIFA UEFA have there? What precedent is there for those organisations?
Yeah, I mean, I promised on the tweet just before we started I wasn't going to talk competition law too much, and I'm going to try and stick to that promise before the viewers go down even more so. But there was a recent speed skating case, more or less, where participants of the actual league, or rather the competition, the governing body, more or less were banned from wanting to participate in a rival competition. And that went all the way to the Court of Justice, who actually ruled in the speed skaters' favour. The issue, therefore, being is that in exactly the same way, FIFA and UEFA are effectively the gatekeepers. They are the regulators, but they're also the competition organisers. There is an inherent conflict in that. And if, for example, there aren't pretty inherent and strong reasons and objectives why they would have to or should be enforcing a ban on particular clubs, or rather the players, from not participating in national team competition, then there's an inherent risk that those types of behaviours could, at least on face value, be seen as attracting antitrust gazes for sure. Now, whether there's enough justification or different justifications, it's one thing. The slight nuances here is we're talking about the players of a team not being able to play a national competition, whereas in the speed skaters, in the ice skating issue, what we're talking about was their ability to not to be able to game, not to be able to work whatsoever because they were banned from the alternative competition. So it's something that's actually cropped up, and I've made a couple of retweets last week from some really great analysis from a few professors that were speaking about those types of parallels. So I think the one thing to bear in mind is, FIFA, UEFA as the regulator and also as the competition organizer, if they are the gatekeepers you've got to think very hard. They've got to think very hard about what they are doing to ensure sanctity of competition, integrity, those types of issues, bearing in mind the ramifications if that thing happened. Now, I think in practice we probably understand that this is probably FIFA and UEFA and the confederations. This is one of their biggest trump cards to be able to play by way of leverage, just as in the inverse, the opposite position, the biggest trump cards for the clubs to play is we're going to do it ourselves. So you almost have this mirroring of position, I guess, from a negotiation position, which is here's where we stand, here are our biggest positions, and now we come together at some point to be able to do that. Because like you talked about, the first thing you talked about today, it's not like these discussions haven't happened before. It's not like clubs are generally profit making, have been in the long term anyway, take away FFP and those better trajectories recently. So clubs are always looking, and have looked for greater ways to ensure more stable revenues, and that's what this is all about. JP Morgan possibly offering reported £300 million per team to be able to cushion that Champions League fall potentially, and that's obviously not to be stiffened at lightly.
Yeah, no, it's fascinating really what the dynamics that play out. I remember in cricket, players who played in the Indian Cricket League, the ICL, were banned from playing in the Indian Premier League, the IPL, which was kind of the officially sanctioned tournament, and were kind of outcast from cricket for a period of time, and obviously lost out on income and so on. Happened with Kerry Packer series in the 70s and 80s as well. But I think you've got these institutions that have been part of the game. FIFA is 107 years old, something like that. That there are going to be upstarts. There are going to be these new organisations, and they shouldn't. There's certainly a line of argument to suggest that they shouldn't just be kind of pushed to one side or squashed away just because they're upstarts. Just been a question from Philip Draper, which keen to get your thoughts, Dan. So on the question of potential employment disputes, if domestic clubs are the employers of the players, not the national governing body. So if a player wants to participate in the World Cup but is being forced to play in a Super League, I mean, is that something that could happen, and you end up with these very awkward scenarios for clubs and players?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is the nuclear option, isn't it? In the
Yeah.
end, you're talking about an extreme situation potentially occurring. And it's not to say it couldn't happen, but I just still think it's very unlikely. But I like the example, which is what happens if you're playing for a team that joins the Super League, and therefore you're suddenly potentially at least disqualified from playing for your national team in what could potentially be the highlight of your career at a Euros or
Yeah.
a World Cup or whatever else it might be. So, no, I can completely see it. I think there's a lot more nuance to be had in a journey into that position. I almost think that would be the case if everything breaks down and there isn't that solution to be found. But I'd be highly doubtful if that situation occurs.
Yeah, and pretty much every thing that you see about the football ecosystem today is almost a circumstance of compromise in some way between organizations. And so the Champions League being a good one in the sense that actually the Swiss model that's been discussed from the year 2024 around having more group matches and so on is to a degree a compromise around the Super League issue, because it's giving European teams like Juve and Real Madrid and so on more European games, whilst not giving them the kind of fully fledged Super League. And so you're absolutely right. The kind of what Philip's outlined is a nuclear option. And so it is still probably not the likely option, because we've never really seen that in football. Because I don't think almost no one wants to leap into the unknown in some ways as to what could happen there. And in many ways, football is working for the teams at the top. It's not broken. They might have frustrations about it. So almost be careful what you wish for in some ways. And I know that there's other areas perhaps we can talk about in other weeks around the abolition of transfer fees or issues like that would completely change the business of the sport. You could argue Bosman did that to a degree, but some of these that we're discussing here would be, really kind of, as I said, black swan, because they're all, we can see them ahead of us, but they're those kind of seismic events that really shake up the sport.
Can I ask just a question on something or a slightly aligned point, Omar, which was obviously as the bigger teams get bigger, one of the issues a while back, when at least the Premier League was changing its rules on different broadcasting models and distributions, was that the benefit of a more egalitarian system domestically, at least, and I guess on a European competition basis, was that then competitive balance improves, that then you're going to have greater instability of result, that you're going to have more unstable results as a positive. You're going to then see greater uncertainty of position to a degree, or at least you're going to have times when lower teams in the league are going to beat the better teams in the league, even if it might well be that between 2 and 4 teams are more likely than not to win the league. I think I remember you guys at 21st Club writing a piece at some point, and don't want to put you on the spot too much, just about how that stratification to a degree of when Champions League monies reach that top level, that actually then it effectively deteriorates competitive balance at the national level. And whether then, in effect, I think one of the arguments that FIFA and UEFA might be able to run quite well is that competitive balance point, that uncertainty of outcome, that needing to have strong competitors becomes quite a strong argument to be able to say, you can't just have all of these breakaway leagues where all the big clubs are going to hoover up a decent or a vast majority of the amount of the money, simply because then everyone else is left behind. And in the end, what you want is more clubs competing and are stronger, which then leads to a better product in any event.
Yeah. I think that's the whole issue of competitive balance. That's the almost delicacy of the ecosystem at the moment. And that's where you could argue it's broken, because I think one of the big things that UEFA have on the front of their minds at the moment is the effect that their money is having on the domestic leagues. And I know Serafin's spoken before around, the distortive effect of, the example I always think of is Ludogorets in Bulgaria. They qualify, well, they invest in their squad. They qualify for the Champions League. They reach the group stages. That's a huge sum of cash for a Bulgarian club. So they go back into the Bulgarian league, got way more money than everyone else, buy some Brazilians and other players, win the league again, Champions League again, and so on. You have this kind of perpetuating effect. And so that's caused issues, and that's why you have the Europa Conference League, which is starting in next season, actually. Yeah, so that's designed to kind of give clubs, an opportunity to play group stage European football, receive a bit more money, kind of smooth the effects within countries a little bit more. But you could argue to a degree we've seen this accelerating effect of UEFA money probably in the last 15, 20 years, where we get the same qualifiers from England, Germany, or particularly England, Spain, Italy to a degree. And these clubs are kind of pulling away to a degree. And that, I don't think it's undermined competitive balance to the extent that their domestic leagues become unattractive, because the Premier League's also been really good at distributing its money equally. But if you ended up in a situation where they're in a breakaway Super League, then they would essentially be attracting all of the fans in world football, because those would be the games everyone wants to watch. Well, certainly that's the assumption that they're making, and that would obviously bring in the TV money. So yes, they would need to think about competitive balance within their own league, but that would certainly have huge repercussions for the rest of football and balance across European football.
And one of the things that we've talked about previously as well, which just sort of came to mind, which was, at some point, I was really interested. Guardiola came up with some comments at the weekend about possibly needing less domestic games. And I wonder whether it fitted into the elite club narrative actually very nicely in a way, which was, we need less games. We don't need the League Cup. We don't want FA Cup replays. We want fewer domestic games, presumably because the top teams want to play each other more often. I presume it's not because they're going to get more breaks. They want more windows to be able to play particular matches. But also on the flip side is that, you've got I was trying to pronounce it right, the Club World Cup, the FIFA Club World Cup, that's possibly being, supposed to happen in China. I think it was obviously not, and whenever that might happen again, which then means almost for every summer period now, never mind in season, is that the period by which players are going to have breaks and the period by which recovery in season and out season just seems to get squashed and reduced every year, because every stakeholder, if it's UEFA, if it's FIFA, if it's the ECA, and if it's the breakaway clubs, if it's the domestic league, if it's the cup competitions, everybody's scrambling for their piece of the calendar. And it just seems that that's going to become more of an important issue as the seasons go on.
Yeah, and this is where you'd argue maybe the American sports model works well, because it's got a lot more of a kind of collaborative approach, and obviously, it's often described as the most socialist leagues in the world in the way that they have kind of caps on salaries and the way that they distribute players and all that kind of stuff. But they, I think, by and large, with some exceptions from what I understand, I'm not a huge kind of follower of American sports, but by and large, yeah, it's all about growing the collective pie and making sure that the collective ecosystem works, so that high school football ladders up to college football, ladders up to the NFL. I was reading an interesting piece in The Economist the other week around potentially in the Major League Baseball and the minor leagues actually having a few issues in terms of their compatibility and the makeup of the system there. But within football, we've got a much more competitive landscape. So we've got historically leagues clashing with each other, confederations clashing with each other, UEFA and FIFA clashing with each other. Everyone, as you say, scrambling for their piece of the pie in many ways. And I think it's all well and good for me to say everyone needs to take a collaborative approach, because actually it's just not feasible. Because if it's a bit of a zero-sum game, then those in the leading positions aren't going to want to give up some of what they have today. So yeah, you can see why we've got to where we've got to today. It's kind of it's just impossible to reverse the car now, which is a shame in many ways, because I think you could if you're designing football 100 years ago, you could have come up with a system that ensured you had this kind of global pyramid that laddered up, and everyone had a pathway through the top, and fans could support clubs at different levels and all that kind of thing. But now we've got a slightly more kind of Jenga tower of football, if you like.
No, it's true. Ian's asked quite an interesting question there, Omar. Maybe it's we were actually talking about Trent beforehand. I know it's slightly off target to a degree, but it's based on the same type of premise of, rested recuperation and otherwise the football clubs that players would be physically shot. I don't think he means that that would be quite harsh if we get a bad performance. But you have no pre-season and struggling to recover their form. I read a great piece in The Athletic about sort of Trent struggles to a degree this season. Fabinho obviously coming into the back four, change of partners on that right-hand side, having to cover in more and not being, as adventurous going forward. Him having COVID, not having pre-season, etc. Obviously, certain tactical nuances as well within all of that as well. But do you think this whole player welfare element is going to, Klopp's talked about it for a while, and a lot of other managers, Guardiola and otherwise, bearing in mind though that their jobs are sometimes at risk, that the managers, by playing or not playing, ultimately they want to play their best players. How does that stakeholder element come into the bigger pie?
Yeah, I do feel for players because they are often treated as the kind of performing monkeys in many ways, and a bit of an afterthought, I think, in the way that the position we've reached to where we are today in many ways, because all the different competitions that come up. You just look at this season, nothing gave in the calendar, so the players being asked to play a lot of games, and the squad, clubs' budgets are squeezed, so the squad sizes are certainly not bigger, smaller, if anything. So yeah, I think the examples of Trent and Kai Havertz are good ones in terms of players being tired. But I do think in that Super League example, what I mentioned earlier around the domestic leagues, what you have is those domestic leagues being just rotation game. The same way that we see the EFL Cup and FA Cup today, where players are rotated. I think that'd just be the domestic league reality. So actually, those players actually might end up in a better position, assuming the kind of money is sufficient at the top end of the game. But you never know. Clubs will want to win everything, want to seal every bit of revenue that they can get. So as ever, the players are a little bit of an afterthought, and I feel for them in that respect, particularly if there's conversations around salary caps, which is one of the big potential motivators of the Super League, is that you have your own regulatory environment. Owners can cap the salaries of the players at a probably higher level than what they've got today. But because the revenues would be even higher, they're not loss-making entities for as much as they are today. So yeah, there is potential for playing body representatives, PFA, FIFA Pro, to want to have a big say in all this.
I read very briefly that that one of the proposals was to cap wages at 55% of revenue. Which was quite an interesting one, because at the moment there aren't too many Premier League clubs that are of that. But I agree that if, for example, those top clubs are more or less tripling their European revenues, that obviously gives a lot more of a buffer to bring those wages down as a percentage of the overall pie. Yeah,
exactly. I mean, in some cases they wouldn't even need, or they wouldn't be able to raise their wages. They could hold their hands up and go, "Oh, the rules say it can't be more than 55%. So if I increase your wage, Messi, then I have to decrease player X and lower down the squad." So and that's again, we spoke about the American model. That's the kind of attraction of the American model, because as an owner you don't have to keep putting money into the club in order to cover the player wages, or borrow money in order to cover it. And having a soft wage cap enables you to do that, although again there's competitive balance implications of that, because if you're only able to raise your wages to a certain level, I think there's some kind of mooted rule around that you could have your wages at 55% or 27.5% of the wealthiest club, which feels a bit finger in the air approach. But you can see how these rules might get kind of concocted in order to have some nod to competitive balance and allow some teams to invest.
At the same time that we've seen the Championship EFL clubs reject an £18 million hard salary cap for going back to the table, possibly for something as a percentage of revenues that they are more looking to fall in line with. So I'm just I love to see these interlinkages between on one side Championship, to the other side Premier League and Super League, and then everything in between, really, just sort of connecting those dots.
Yeah, exactly. And I think there's a lot there's a lot of leagues are trying to take from each other and learn from each other. But again, the competitive environment means that you end up some teams happy, some teams unhappy, some leagues happy, some leagues unhappy, and ultimately, the money talks.
Omar, we're at 1:30 again.
Oh, indeed. No, it's really interesting. I think it's a fascinating topic. As you say, I'm not sure we'll end up nuclear option, but it's going to rumble on, I think.
Great to chat as always, mate.
Nice one. All right, mate. I'll see you next week.
Cheers.